Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I've done anything on the Series 2, so I thought I'd make a video today that's hopefully going to help a lot of you out. We're going to be going through making a new harness from scratch, and I know it's a topic that a lot of people shy away from, or they think, it's electrical, I don't want to touch it. But if you want to learn, this is probably the easiest vehicle you can have to wire up. I'm going to make a few modifications from when it left the factory. I'll talk you through them later, but I'm just going to go real slowly, real basic, and hopefully you'll be able to make your own harness based on the same principles. Okay, so I think it's quite well known you can buy a harness off the shelf. You're probably looking at 6 to 10 week lead time with that, and it's going to come as Land Rover intended, and you can have options for alternator, by the rear harness separate, etc, etc. And so I think it's a lot better to build your own harness. You can modify the wiring diagram, make it, I'd say, safer. You're going to get a better understanding, so if you have any issues at the side of the road, you're going to know the system very well because you've put it together. And even if you buy the harness, you're going to have to work out where all the connectors go, etc, etc. So I'll talk you through first the tools you're going to need for the job, and then the new wiring diagram, or circuit diagram, or how I've modified it for this Land Rover in particular. So here are the tools I recommend you having. You need a multimeter or voltmeter and an ohm meter, and you don't need an expensive one. This is the cheapest one you can buy probably. I've got a more expensive one, but I'm just going to use this to show you don't need a fancy one. I can do all sorts of equipment, things. Just need to measure voltage and resistance. Then got automatic wire strippers, another set of wire strippers there. Got a crimp tool here, another crimp tool there, some snips, and a selection of screwdrivers. And then I'm going to have over here for the bullet connectors, and then I've got a heat gun there, and the reason for that is on a lot of the connections, or most of them, I've gone for a heat shrink connector. It gives a bit more bite on the cable, so you're less likely to have the cable pull out. And then in the box behind this, you can see I've got automotive waterproof connectors, and they're going to go anywhere there's a connection under the car, or under the vehicle if you like, primarily to connect the loom for the rear of the car with the main harness that's going to sit on the bulkhead. We'll go through that later. And then I've got a 12 volt power supply. What this does is basically takes 230 volt from your mains to the socket there. You can turn it on, we can adjust the voltage to get 12 volts. And what this is really handy for is just testing your lights, your horn, etc, etc, so you know all is working well before you fit to the car. Last thing you want to do is fit everything up and then find something doesn't work. You've got to backtrack, taking things apart. And finally I'll talk you through the wiring. So here you can see the dashboard. I've got charging light, main beam light, the heater light. I'm also, it's missing off the diagram, but there's a fuel low light, the panel light switch, and the oil pressure light to go on the top there. I'm just going to keep that for reference. When I pull the cables through, I know which holes they're going to go through. And then this would have been the original wiring diagram for this car. And so you can see all this circuit here, that's to do with your lighting, main beam, dipped, side lights, etc. And if you go up, you can see it comes in off this line, off number 1 on the ignition switch, and it's not even fused in. So, you know, you can see this is on a dynamo. We've got a voltage stabilizer as well. I'm going to be running an alternator on this one, so I'm actually going to get rid of the voltage stabilizer. But in the later models, you can see they've done a similar thing. They've got rid of the voltage stabilizer. They've got a alternator here, and when it came onto the later models, you can see that the lights, they run through this fuse number 1. But my problem with this is you can see down here, fuses 1 to 8, 35 amp. So your whole system's running off 35 amp fuses. That means you're going to need wires that are capable of taking 35 amps, because the fuse should be the weakest point in your system. You could have a small short circuit that's maybe drawing 20-25 amps, not going to blow your fuse, but it will be enough to melt the wire if you're using a smaller gauge wire. That cannot take the amperage, and for what it's worth, I don't think it's worth the risk. So what I've done is I've changed this. I've got 10 fuses in mine, and what I can essentially do then is decrease the rating on each fuse, decrease my wire size accordingly, makes it cheaper, and also if you get a fault, you're going to be able to locate it a lot faster than running everything off less fuses. So I've got hand-drawn drawing here. That's my interpretation of it. You see you've got 10 fuses here in my fuse board. If I was to design it again, I'd maybe add 12 fuses, just so you can split the left-hand, right-hand side dipped main beam. At the moment I've got them running off the same fuse, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. And then, yeah, I'll make a copy of this available at some point. This is just hand drawn. I can annotate it. Any small changes I need to do, I will do. And then I'll draw all up on the computer, make it available to you guys. As you saw, new switches, I'd recommend definitely swap over all these switches, even if they work or are okay. It's, you know, this is over 60 years old now. For what it costs versus having to replace it later on, I would say use all new switches. And then finally, the most important tool is going to be this, your circuit diagram. This is going to be for when you wire up, and then later on down the line you always want to keep a copy in the vehicle with you, so if you have any problems it's going to be so much easier to diagnose. Big pet peeve of mine is when people modify wiring, things like that. Don't make a diagram, don't write it down, and then you'll have someone come to you with a problem, and to fault find, first you've got to find out what the person's actually done. And there's been a lot of jobs I've done where it's just been a case of I've ripped out the modification someone else has done before and start again, because it's less time consuming than trying to work out, tracing cables, where does this go to, where does this go to, is this the correct rating, etc, etc. When I publish this, I'll actually put what rating fuses I've got, what rating for the cables I've got as well. So I'm not saying it's the best or to follow me, but it will give you a good idea if you've got a diesel with a converter onto an alternator of how I'd wire it up at least. Yeah, that's the first thing to be able to do, is go through all your switches, all your lights. Your switch is going to be tested with an ohm meter and the resistance across them in the on-off position, or however many poles it's got. And then things like your lights, you can put a voltage across it and make sure that that light is working. But I think now we'll get the vehicle up in the air. Not necessarily to have a ramp, but just to be able to show you, it's going to be a lot easier when the vehicle's up. I can get much better footage. Yeah, we'll break this circuit down into smaller bits and make it very simple. Okay, so I think I'm ready to get started on the wiring. I'm going to do the rear harness first, just get that out of the way, and it's a good job done. And can move on to the forward bit then. It's probably the simplest. Forward, guess it's not complicated, but it's a bit more things in the way. So I'll turn the camera around and I'll show you what the plan of action is. So there, very handy tip, 2 axle stands and a bar between them, and then off there I'm just going to be able to pull the cables. And yeah, so I'm going to internally route the cables. It's going to go in through here, and it's, for me, I always find it's easier to feed it from the front to the aft, because reaching down into there can be quite tricky, whereas the aft one, it's a bit close to the bottom, you can get in a lot easier. I've got my brake switch here, and so what I'll do is I've got 7 cables coming out. The brake one's going to go straight onto there on a spade connector, and then I'll have a 6-pin waterproof connector, as I spoke about earlier. You're going to get some water coming up here, and so 6-pin, and then if I ever need to remove the bulkhead or something like that, I can just disconnect here, and then that's going to free the bulkhead. And I'm going to bear that in mind for the entire build, sort of serviceability in the future if we need to disconnect, etc, etc. I'm also going to fit a grommet into here, so I'll pull the cable, I'll pull the grommet on first, because if I say I'm going to do it later after I've cut it and feed it from the other end, I'm sure to forget. But yeah, we'll pull the cable back then. We're going to come out of this hole here, again fit another grommet. It's not sharp, but it's just, I think, good practice. And the cable's going to be sort of braided together and covered in fleece tape, and then finally going to go up through this hole, and then that's going to feed up to our rear lights at the back here. Okay guys, so as you saw, that took a bit of time. Probably be easier with extra hands just to help feed the wire through when it's going through the chassis. But yeah, first I've braided it a little bit. That just gives a bit more strength if anything pulls on it. And then wrapped it with the fleece tape just to make it a bit more original looking. And I've pulled out the back, I've terminated it here, I've put the spade connector on for the brake light switch. Now I've got to do the 6-pin connector here, but the video's probably gone on quite a while already, so I'll cut here and I'll do a part 2, part 3, part 4, etc, etc. So if you found it helpful, please like and subscribe and look out for the other videos.